ClimateAction.tech is a community of tech professionals with the goal to inspire and empower each other to take climate action. Without further ado, I am going to let our panelists introduce themselves. I will call you out, and if you can just please say a couple of words about yourselves, not necessarily your action guides just yet, which is the focus of this salon. So Inji, where are you, Inji? Inji, would you like to introduce yourself for us?
Thanks, Heather. Kia ora koutou, everyone. My name is Inji Johnston, and I'm a New Zealander who's a lawyer and currently based in London, and worked in both mitigation and now adaptation. Thanks.
Melissa?
Hi, my name's Melissa. I'm based in New York City, and I'm currently a student at Columbia. I'm studying sustainability management, and I'm also a coordinator for CAT.
Ayana.
Hey y'all, my name is Ayana. I'm a senior associate with Drawdown Labs, which is the private sector engagement program of Project Drawdown. I've been here for about a year now, and my background is primarily in climate and conservation policy, and recently kind of switched over to business engagement around climate advocacy.
And last but not least, Julian.
Thanks. Yeah, Julian Cross-Polk. I'm based in Berkeley, California. And I'm also a senior associate at Project Drawdown, so working with Ayana to engage businesses and investors on how to scale climate solutions quickly, safely, and equitably. So that's kind of what we do.
Thank you all. So as today is all about action guides, how do we create action guides? What are action guides? The how-tos, tips and tricks on how to create them for mitigation and adaptation. I would love to hear, to kick us off, a little bit about each of the action guides that you've been involved in. So Ayana and Julian, tag team, can you kick us off and tell us a little bit about the Drawdown Labs action guide?
Sure, I can just start, Julian, and then I'll toss it over to you. So we recently released this report, or playbook really, called Climate Solutions at Work, and Julian's sticking the link in the chat, thank you. Really focused on kind of two goals. Well, maybe I'll start with some background. First, Drawdown Labs works with businesses and investors and philanthropies to scale climate solutions, and really kind of like go beyond this idea of just net zero. At Labs, we don't really see net zero as kind of like a leadership position. It's really kind of the status quo for private sector like climate action right now. And so we started to think more about how can businesses do better, and instead of just doing less harm, like actually do good in the world. And so Climate Solutions at Work is really focused on two things. One is like creating that new framework and new standard for business climate leadership, and really like elevating the standard for leadership in the corporate space. And then the other goal of it is really to like help employees who work at these companies to see themselves as part of like the climate movement. We really think that every job should be a climate job. And so we're hoping this guide helps really democratize climate action, so that you don't have to be on a sustainability team to be able to work on climate action within your company or organization. And so we kind of outline different areas where companies, but also employees, have a lot of leverage to take climate action. And I can toss it over to Julian if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I think Ayana did a great job of summarizing the guide. But essentially right now, I think what we've identified is that the private sector plays like a super important role, or will play a super important role in helping us meet our climate goals. Actually trying to get to the point of drawdown, which is the same as net zero by 2050, to kind of stay below this 2 degrees goal that we really need to try to limit warming to. But right now, like the kind of standard is just far too low. It's not nearly as ambitious as it needs to be in order to kind of scale solutions as quickly as they need to be scaled. And especially as public policy and global governance is lagging, the private sector plays a super important role. And so our kind of hope is that we can really start to kind of raise the bar, raise the standard, and make sure that everybody is kind of part of that process, so everybody can kind of see themselves in that movement. I was just going to put one last link into the chat, which is that the overall framework. So Ayana mentioned that kind of, we're essentially identifying multiple levers that aren't typically thought of in like sustainability or corporate climate action. And so making sure that those leverage points are really kind of normalized as like key business actions. So in addition to, reducing emissions, people also should be really advocating for strong climate policy and making sure that their investments in finance are aligned with, their climate values and their other values. So yeah, that's a little bit more to add.
Thank you both so much. Melissa, can you jump in and tell us a little bit about what you're working on?
Sure. I'm working on a few projects right now. First, I'm a fellow with the Green Web Foundation, and I'm working with 4 other fellows and investigating the intersection of sustainability, justice, and the internet. And our goal is to create a syllabus and tools to help other internet practitioners learn about the topic as well. I'll post some links after this. And then I'm also working with ClimateAction.tech as the coordinator for the information circle. And for that, I'm working with volunteers to kind of move our Slack conversations into a more permanent place for other people to learn as well. So we have a wiki, which is semi-private, and then we also have our website, and you can see our guides there. We only have 4 guides so far, so it's been kind of like it's been really difficult to create these guides. So from that, I started another project in collaboration with 350 Bay Area called Carl. It stands for the Climate Action Resource Library, and we did a lot of brainstorming with Drawdown Labs. So it's really exciting to see Julian and Ayana here again. We're still building a prototype, but the main idea behind Carl is that we'll have guides for each of the most common jobs in the US. And we're going to focus on the top 5 actions for every job. So these are actions that you can do like tomorrow at work without organizing, without asking your boss for permission. And we kind of see each of these guides as a doorway into climate action. So it's not going to be like super in depth, but it will help people see their work decisions as like levers for changing the system to be more sustainable. And the last point I'll make about it is we're hoping that these will be living documents that are created with the community and with workers themselves.
I'm going to dive into that in a little bit with another couple of questions, but as well, I would love to hear from Inji. Inji, can you tell us about what you're working on?
Yeah, thank you, Heather. I'll just be, for this conversation, drawing on a few examples to kind of broaden the ideas about which kind of context action guides can be used in, because they can be used both internally in organizations and externally. So an example of an internal one that I worked on was for a disaster risk management NGO in Colombia called Cooperación Antioquia Presente. And there, my work was really helping them in the form of an action guide to understand how they can mainstream SDGs in their work, and particularly from a climate change angle, and then in turn, how those kinds of steps can help build policies and things like that to be able to access a great amount of funds, but more importantly to make sure that their entire operations are actually operating in a way that is supportive of the SDGs. Also, another one example of an external facing action guide came from Generation Zero, which is a New Zealand-based climate organization. And there, this action guide was really focused on enabling volunteers to take action to contact their local member of parliament. And so it had steps as to how they might go about doing that, what kind of topics they might want to raise and talk about. And the focus of this was during the time that New Zealand was undergoing consultation for our first Zero Carbon Act, which ultimately did get passed. And so it was building that kind of bipartisan support in the background. Third one, which was from the start of this year, more adaptation focus, was the Global Center on Adaptation. And so that was part of the youth leadership team, and that was the focus of that one was basically a guide to enable youth to be able to better take part in their national adaptation plans that are part of the Paris Agreement. So that involves steps such as assessing the lay of the land in terms of which countries have them and what they kind of look like and how to access them. And importantly, just steps for youth engagement and building on best practices in that space. And finally, the fourth one is one with adapt action. And so this is an NGO, we're working on practical adaptation solutions. So this adaptation guide is quite different from the others in that it actually focuses on tangible practical adaptation measures that communities in developing countries can take, today, in the next week, in the next month. And so the focus of that one is again quite different, but it just shows the range of contexts that action guides can be employed in. Thanks.
So true, and that's one of the reasons that I'm so happy to have such a variety of perspectives here on the panel, because just heard 4 or 5 very, very distinctly different contexts and ways that action guides can be used, how they can be produced, etc. So I'm really interested to hear each of your thoughts on, how. So I might skip what is a guide because you kind of will get through that in context, but how do you go about creating these sorts of things for such a variety of audiences? Do you try to appeal to many audiences at once? Do you appeal to one audience at a time? How do you go about doing this? Inji, you're on my screen and just finished. Do you want to kick us off?
Cool, fantastic. So yeah, to build on just even that point about what an action guide is, I think it's really helpful to see it as a process and not a final end product. And so as part of that, it's really important to undertake an initial, and kind of think of it as this action down the bottom of the page, kind of so A makes up the assess the status quo, and so that involves getting a really good lay of the land about what information is out there and about who your target audience is and what action you want to achieve. And then the C is the actual consultation, and to your question, I think it's absolutely essential that the target audience is identified as specific as possible, and that actually having conversations with them before starting a guide to understand if this would be a useful resource is a really key part of that. I can talk to the later steps later on, but I thought that would be a good start.
Perfect start. Any of the other panelists, however you want to jump in, please, if you have some thoughts, please share.
Yeah, I love the idea of the guide being a process, not like a kind of final deliverable. I think that, that sort of relates to what Melissa was talking about, it being kind of community developed and driven. And I think like the reality is the last thing you want for a guide is to kind of like produce, especially in this day and age, like a PDF that's like the static thing that like people don't actually engage with. And so I think we've been really, excited the way that our guide it's started to be kind of used and contextualized, and folks have really taken this framework that we've developed and like kind of made it fit in their own businesses. So this guide is intended to be, pushing businesses, generic businesses of pretty much, varying sizes. We kind of have maybe a slight slant towards the corporate, larger company. But it's supposed to be applicable to all businesses. But of course, all businesses are very different, and so there's a level of interpretation, extrapolation that needs to happen from the guide. And so I think like making sure that that's sort of clear in the design of the guide is probably a great thing to design for, I guess. So I'll just add that.
I'll just jump in really quickly about the Climate Solutions at Work guide and kind of addressing Sandra's question a bit about like, I think one, like identifying the audience is sometimes when you like put everything out there on paper, like sometimes the audience becomes clear, which doesn't sound super intuitive, but I feel like was kind of what happened with our guide, is that like we just like had all of these ideas of like what this new standard or framework should look like, and then we kind of from there, just based off of like what we do at Drawdown Labs, which is primarily like interfacing with like sustainability teams, we like noticed that there was also kind of a need to like move beyond just sustainability teams. And I feel like that like realization in tandem with like just kind of like putting everything out onto the Google Doc was really helpful to realize that like, oh, like employees across different teams would actually find this super useful. And also just like doing a lot of like getting to like what Melissa said, to like having it be like a living document and like doing a lot of like outreach afterwards to those specific audiences has been really helpful to like, one, promote it and have it like be used, but also like to get feedback and see like how we can iterate on this guide like moving forward.
Yeah, I think it's important to talk about the iteration because we're all here trying to change the world, right? So, and the world isn't static. So there does need to be like constant tweaks and updates. And then I also want to mention for people who are like thinking about writing a guide, it doesn't have to be like so big also. Like I think with the cat guides, there is value in just sort of forcing yourself to document how you've done something. That can obviously have a ripple effect and help others, but it can also just help yourself to sort of, you know, clarify your thoughts and to see how things work. So it kind of depends on why you're creating a guide as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Melissa. And on that, you know, we in getting ready for this panel, we had a number of discussions. It's interesting that there are so many different types of guides out there, and I really want to kind of hone in a little bit on this, along with, you know, how do you make sure that once you've published them, they're actually used and shared. An action guide doesn't necessarily have to be a 40-page published, fully marketingized document, right? So, you know, can you give us a couple of thoughts on, you know, lengths and how you get your knowledge out there without being worried about sharing that knowledge? Melissa, I think you called out a little bit about fears when we spoke about these. So how do you address that?
I think, well, with the Green Web Foundation, what we're doing is we're talking about it as learning in the open. So we try to take kind of, I want to say like a student kind of approach, like this is what we've learned, this is what we've synthesized, and we're hoping that other people can learn with us. Maybe that falls outside of the realm of a guide, but something that Chris Adams has said to me when I talk to him about fear is kind of like the sooner you start sharing things, the sooner that other people can help you and can join you on your project. So you can also, you know, you can also build like the marketing, say, as you're building the guide, kind of like share your work. There's this book by Austin Kleon about sharing your work and how to sort of build a community around what you're doing. And that the community is also important because it's hard to do change on your own. Like, especially with a Drawdown Labs guide, I think the advice that they give, they are pushing the bar, right? They're raising the bar for what climate action looks like, and it helps to have a community to help support you.
Yeah, I'll just build off that a little bit. I mean, I love that question because I think that there's a lot of reasons why you know, people, I guess the barriers to climate action, right? We live in a world that's like inherently unsustainable, so it kind of feels so intimidating, hard to get started. But I think like there's I think there's so much power and just like sort of taking that first step and like acknowledging that you're not the expert, but that you're learning, and that and I think like essentially being that person where you're like acknowledging that you're learning, but you're still being a spokesperson is so inspiring to people. And so I just encourage, I like love that framework that you just like put out there, Melissa. And I think it's really important to kind of like continue to use folks' voices a bit more and more, because it'll just inspire others to kind of get involved. And the reality is no single person has the answers, and everybody's kind of learning. And so if you can kind of just contribute to that and like, you know, do your small part, I think that's really powerful. So don't be afraid to start a guide. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And G, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well, because you've spoken about students, you've spoken about volunteers, internal, external to work, you know, different lengths, I'm sure, of different guides or calls to action. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think yeah, it comes back to the envisaging it as a process and not a guide. Also means heavily, you know, emphasizing that it's a guide. You know, it's not intended to be exhaustive. It's intended to be a general framework that people, your target audience, hopefully will find useful to apply it. And I think one really useful aspect, and this links to earlier questions in the chat about how one might make sure that it's actually being used, is actually the value in, again, surveying or interviewing your target audience after it's gone out there, and actually integrating examples of the specific ways in which they've been able to use it and employ it on the ground. So for example, with the volunteers, it was really useful to be able to say, hey, look, Josie in Palmerston North did this thing with her MP, here's some photos, you know, it went really well, but she, you know, did find these aspects were a bit difficult. And, you know, being able to build those aspects into an adaptive kind of guide is really useful to ensuring that you are keep learning and keep growing, but also that people can see the value of the guide in action too.
And I'll jump in really quickly with one thing that came to mind, just like listening to everyone talk, is that super important to like acknowledge that you're learning. And I think that's like it makes it more accessible to other people, which I think is what Julian was talking about. But also like, don't be afraid to know that you do know things and that you have like knowledge within whatever like industry or organization or whatever like sphere of influence that you're operating within, whether that be like at your workplace or a community group or at school or whatever. You probably know more than you think you do. That can, you know, you don't need to be like a climate expert to like just like start putting things on paper and like talking to people and kind of thinking about climate action in the context of like what you're already working on.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great lead into a question that we have in the chat, which is how easy do you find resourcing and securing investment and funding into creating and maintaining resources like this? And how do you make the case for these? And to add on to that, you know, taking the conversation that we've had thus far around, you know, the length or detail that they need to be in, could they be just, you know, something that you do on your own? Does it need investment? Can you all give your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I could speak to it a little bit, and I'm curious to hear what other folks have to say. But I mean, I think this, like, I read that question, and my immediate follow up was kind of what's the more specific context, you know, for us, you know, we are operating in a nonprofit organization where we get like individual donors and foundation funding, and so we kind of are doing that grant writing to kind of get that you know, those financial resources to do this, and it's all mission driven. One of the things that we talk about is instead of like asking for the resources, just sort of talk about the impact that you can make, you know, within our kind of fundraising scopes. You just like talk about like all the amazing things that this guide will do, or the resource that you want to produce will do, and then like the funding will kind of maybe come more naturally after that. But yeah, I'd be curious about the kind of more specific context where that is, where you're kind of like hoping to build out a resource.
Yeah, I think so. I work for an agency, like a service design agency. So we have a model of, you know, working on projects and being paid for projects by clients. So it's probably quite different, and I'm not 100% familiar with the, you know, fundraising approaches for nonprofits. But yeah, I'm just, you know, thinking about when people, you know, invest or donate money to something. Like I would think that they would want to see, you know, like a specific project or like the actions that people will be doing, and yeah, the impact coming out of it. And as you said, like I'm just curious if they're asking, you know, if you already have partners to test the guide with, or to kind of implement some of the actions that are written on it, to be sure that it's going to be yeah, basically applied and making an impact, or, you know, like it's recognized that there isn't enough like condensed knowledge out there. And especially I've read the guide actually, which I found really useful for employees, that maybe there aren't enough like targeted guides for that. So yeah, I'm just curious to know like how regarding if that's the right word, you know, funders are.
I don't know if others have thoughts on this, but yeah, I mean, I think you know, our whole message in the guide is that every job can be a climate job, and so I think, like, you know, you should ask about you know, if you have a good idea in terms of making a small guide. I think just starting to kind of put ideas on paper and you know, start that process, acknowledging sort of the areas of expertise that you do have. And yeah, I think that you probably could get some financial resources to back you. Right now, I mean, sustainability and climate action is a very hot topic, and it's very, very like, there's a lot of resources that people are willing to spend towards those. So I don't know if others have thoughts.
I think having, I think with Drawdown Labs, we were like fortunate that like the way that our program is structured, we already have like these business partners that have like already agreed to be a part of labs, and like kind of by way of that, like have kind of agreed to like maybe try to implement some of the stuff in this guide. But I think that it is really helpful to like maybe have like some groups like kind of already on board with what you like type of guide you want to be writing, and like are kind of open to like kind of beta testing it or something. I think that is really helpful to like kind of show that there are people already like not only willing to test it, but like they're really interested and they want to like test something like that, or like try to implement something that like would be talked about in your guide. So having like willing people already like ready to go, I think is super helpful.
Melissa, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this with the different types of guides and communities that you're working with. This seems kind of right up your alley.
Really, I think it's up Ingie's alley because she's created more like public guides. But I'll say really quickly, for the Green Web Foundation, that they did get a grant. They got grant money for that, so they have to apply for grants. I feel like I don't know a lot about it, but I think that is a whole process, and you do have to kind of show metrics and results, and that can take a lot of work as well. If you're doing it more personally, I've seen other people kind of just do Patreons or some sort of like crowdfunding, you know, like if you have a wider audience. And then in our research for Carl, and we still don't have a business model, honestly. We're probably going to try to get foundation funding as well, but we've talked to other places where they also have private partners, and then they have a program. So they've created a guide. It's not public really, and only the members have access to it, and they create kind of like a community and some workshops and employee engagement type of program, and that's how they get funding for that. So the corporations pay to be a member. But yeah, I'd love to hear Ingie's experience with funding.
Yeah, I think it is a really good question, and one that really speaks to how, you know, the kind of first steps people might take in terms of operationalizing the ideas for the action guides they have in their head during the session. I would say, I guess, you know, I see resources in two domains. You know, on the one side, you've got financial resources that can enable time, and then on the other side, you know, there is time itself, and those can be volunteer hours, which are also a really useful resource in creating some of the guides, particularly from a not-for-profit perspective. I would say, I guess, one of the first ones in terms of Corporación Presente, there it was a case of building the internal business case as to why this guide would be something that would be used, also something that would open up doors in terms of, you know, funding opportunities, given that, as Julian said, you know, the importance of climate and sustainability policies is actually really only growing. And so I think there's a really strong business case to go to organizations to request time to be dedicated to crafting the guide, or financial resources to be pulled together, again, to facilitate making one. And then, you know, on the other side, adaptation, that is completely voluntary. And so in that term, in that context, it's really important to build, you know, the case for why volunteers should get involved. And in that situation, it was about highlighting how, you know, the majority of climate change resources are in English, and only in English. And so it's actually a really important mission to be able to provide resources that are actually translated into the languages of the people where climate change is having its greatest impact already. And so I think the business case can be built in these different ways, and it's about understanding which is appropriate for your context, because again, you know, action guides can be long or they can be short, and I think whichever it is, there's always steps that you can take to help initiate that process.
So that has me thinking, like, what are those steps, right? For people that are on this this call, and for people that would be listening who have never even thought to do an action guide, but may have a lot of experience in a particular area or two. How do you get started? I mean, how do you go from I have this idea to putting it on paper without necessarily having investment or even a volunteer or two, or you might want to get a volunteer. How do you go about taking that action yourself to create some sort of a guide?
I'm just going to refer, I guess, kind of thinking of like the tech community, right? Like I was a WordPress developer and I learned from other people writing tutorials and guides. I think people kind of have an impulse to create and to share what you've done. And I think so many people are concerned about climate change right now that it is possible to find volunteers and to get help. So yeah, I was just curious, do people want to like raise their hands? Like, are you working on a guide now? Have you published one? You should like share it in the chat and we can take a look at who's here, because this could be a more open conversation.
Yeah, I'll also just say too, just to kind of add off that, I think that if folks have like questions, I think most of us are on the CAT Slack. And so if you have like follow-up questions or like kind of want to riff and like share an idea, feel free to reach out to us on the CAT Slack or over email, and we can also do some help brainstorming if we get a little bit more context around the specific ideas. But yeah, I think like we've said, like, there's so much interest in climate and sustainability right now. Like if you think about the spheres of influence that you have, and also you're kind of like the area that you operate in, whether it's like sort of your workplace, our whole guide is climate solutions at work, trying to make every job a climate job, but also, like maybe it's your hobby, maybe you're into tennis or into chess or whatever, there's opportunities for building kind of community wherever you operate. And I think people are really like ready to act, has been my experience. Like if you give people tangible ways to act and ways to relate to like climate action, people are going to be so receptive to that. So I would just say like run with your ideas and start to talk to people. And like I guess that's like maybe the first step is just talking about it and starting to incubate ideas.
We do, now we've got hands going up, yay. I do have one question in the chat, so I'm going to jump to that one quickly and then we'll go through hands. What goals did you define for your guides and how are you measuring against them? Do you define success as engagement with the guide or as results?
It's a great question. It's actually something that we're grappling with and talking about a lot internally right now. I think at the early stages, it's a little bit hard to kind of think about like the action that's resulted from it. So like we're mostly looking for engagement. So like the number of people who are reading the guide and the number of presentations we're giving about the guide, and essentially the number of people, like number of eyes that are looking at the resource. For the specific climate solutions at work guide, we've gotten a lot of great traction. And what's been really great is it's sort of grown pretty naturally, and so it's been kind of like passed around and between various organizations and business partners. I think somebody mentioned in the chat, have you seen the climate solutions at work guide in the wild? And we definitely have. It's been pretty amazing to see. So I guess the first metric would be like, the number of eyes that are looking at the guide and seeing the resource. And then the second metric is like, is there some action associated with it? Which is obviously the goal. And we have started to see that, which has really been pretty amazing, even in this kind of short period of time since September when we published it, where we see, like large businesses coming back to us and saying, we're actually going to incorporate this framework into our employee engagement like strategy. So we're going to use like all of the content in the guide and leverage points that you've identified to essentially like remake our employee engagement strategy, which is just super exciting because this guide, which in our mind is pretty like putting forth a pretty ambitious new standard for business leadership, if that gets into the hands of employees, then employees have this power to say like, here's the standard, and we're going to hold the company that we work at to that high standard. And we're also going to feel empowered in our own jobs to kind of like make sure that our job function is aligned with, Drawdown, aligned with climate action. So yeah, it's been mostly anecdotal, which I think is really powerful, hearing these anecdotes from folks. But yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Julian. I'll just jump in here as well, because yeah, again, really interesting question. And I think it again can be used to highlight the range of different contexts that action guides can be employed in. For example, it could be a very short-term campaign that has very tangible steps for a tangible outcome, and that once that tangible outcome is reached, the guide has essentially achieved, itself as the action has already come to life. So I think you're kind of designing these guides so that they'll one day become redundant because the actions are actually already been achieved, and then you can kind of build on and keep working for the next change. But right when it gets released, and in terms of thinking about distribution and how folks have mentioned about the amounts of eyes and presentations you're kind of actually using, like how you're sharing it, that's where key metrics about engagement can be really crucial. And then that as well can be really important in terms of making sure that you still have that business case for ongoing support from an organization, wherever you're getting funding. Some key metrics about where it's gone to and how many people it's reached can also be essential at that stage. But really, yeah, success should be defined by you, and it's very context dependent depending on the guide.
Thank you so much for that different perspective. I'm going to jump to the next question. Melissa, if you want to jump in, please do. But we have 2 hands up.
Yes, my question was around, so yeah, it's really exciting and it's a really perfect timing actually for me to join this session. I'm really glad that I managed to come in, because I've started already to publish a guide which I've been kind of building over time. But not a guide, I call it a toolkit or a library, which I've been building for myself, mainly in my kind of old time, outside of my job, when learning around how to design more consciously for people and planet. So it looks at like ethical design, like sustainability, various different aspects. And I still feel like I have so much to learn. But yeah, I went to a talk that inspired me to just start sharing it, and that highlighted the importance of sharing our intellectual property and stop being precious about it, as many, especially like commercial companies try to do, consultancies as well. I'm in the consultancy world, and it's all about intellectual property and knowledge. So yeah, I've decided to do that. But yeah, just conscious that it was really done a lot in my own time, and I had to do that outside of my job. So I just wondered if like you had, and I haven't finished looking at the guide, I'm halfway through, if you had pointers to where to start, basically, like where to start to go from making it an informal and small things that you do on the side to really embedding it, the actions, into the day-to-day of the business, and if there were little tools almost, or roadmap to know where to start, basically.
I can jump in and try to answer some of that. But you bring up a really good point. We've spoken to a lot of different employees, like kind of like trying to do climate work at their jobs. And like I feel like the 2 buckets are like the people who feel like they have to do things kind of like as like an extracurricular at work. And then some people I feel like have gotten really lucky, and like that extracurricular has like turned into their jobs. Like I've talked to a few people who like created new roles for themselves. But obviously you have to be like fortunate enough to work at a place where they're like really open to being like, oh yeah, like you can just like have that be your job now, which I know is not the case for most people probably. But I would say like what you're doing is like a great first step, is just like kind of like working with other people who are really interested in this. And it's awesome to hear that you're kind of pushing from the inside your company to like really take climate seriously. One thing that we talk about in the guide, or the Climate Solutions at Work guide, is like power mapping. So like kind of understanding like who in your organization is the right person to like bring an ask to and like form a relationship with. And oftentimes that isn't like usually your CEO or like executive leadership. Sometimes it's like one step down, who you can have a closer relationship with, who then also has a closer relationship with leadership and like more decision makers. So sometimes it's kind of thinking about like that who's like the next person up who can make more decisions than I can, but isn't necessarily like the CEO. And then I think just like talking about it with more and more people, and like maybe the first step is like forming, maybe you already have like a green team at work where it's kind of informal, but I've also heard of cases where like green teams, like the things that they have worked on have become like company-wide policies and things like that. So yeah, I would say like gathering your people and like identifying who the right people are, who the right decision makers are in your company to kind of tap. But I don't know if Julian or anyone else wants to add anything to that.
Yeah, I want to say, so you tap those people and then you want to try to convince them, but show them that sustainability is part of professional development, right? Like all of our jobs are going to we'll need these skills. We'll all need to kind of understand the footprint of our work. And so it doesn't become an extra thing. It's more just about you becoming a better designer or you creating better ad campaigns, things like that. And also the second thing you need to do, so that's one for like the employees to see it as professional development, and then for the business to really define like, how does sustainability fit in with their mission? And that's like a more long-term thing. And I think you need to have those conversations, and eventually the business model might have to change a little bit, or how you take on clients will change. But it's good to have those talks now.
All really, really good points. And I will move on to the next question.
Yeah, so I had a question more in regards to formatting and the software tools that you may use to create one of these. And I've just realized that, you know, I've made PDFs and implementation guides and no one goes to them. But if I make a website, you know, you attract a lot more users. So I'm just curious about your own experiences about which like formatting is best, and then which tools you might use. Let's say you are making PDF, what tools you might use if it's something that's outside of like, you know, Adobe and Word.
Whoever wants to jump in, but good, you just came off mute. I was going to ask Melissa, because you have a couple of different formats you're working on.
Oh, I think it depends on your audience. You know, like if you're talking to like academics or somebody in like the government, I assume they like PDFs, right? And then if you're creating something where you want more conversation, then a website with comments is better. So I think it depends on who you're talking to and what kind of engagement you want.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think that's a great point. I think definitely depends on the audience. But I think you're definitely right. And my experience working in the nonprofit sector, producing guides and feeling like they're just sitting on a virtual shelf somewhere and not being used, that's definitely a phenomenon that happens frequently. And something we talked a lot about, you know, as we were producing this guide, which is, you know, at the end of the day, a PDF, but what we tried to do is really try to, you know, make it visually engaging as possible. So we, you know, I mean, Project Drawdown is really good at using these big kind of captivating photos. And so we tried to kind of like have some design themes that were really powerful. And then also, I think really importantly is having like some graphics and like that and or like executive summaries, documents that are much shorter and like contain all the like message that you want to get across. Like, you know, this message, every job can be a climate job, right? Like that's, you know, it's like a sentence, but it encapsulates essentially like a big gist of what we were trying to get across in this guide. And so making sure that you can sort of distill whatever your message is so that somebody who's just looking at it at a glance can kind of like be captivated and then kind of want to go deeper. And that can be with graphics or, you know, small slogans like that, or like really good visuals. But yeah, I'm not a graphic designer. I don't know if Iona has any other thoughts.
There's one thing I'll add. Yeah, great point. I was also going to just say, like, make sure if it is a PDF, you can kind of have like this tearaway page almost if anyone were to print it out, but like no one's going to. But just like a one page in the PDF that like can just be in someone's mind. Like for us, it's like that drawdown aligned business framework graphic. And the only other thing I would add is that like if it's to like think about like how to iterate moving forward. So it's like maybe you have a PDF and maybe it's like a little bit boring or static, but there's like, you can still build off of that. And so like something that we're thinking about doing is like, yes, we have a PDF, but like, what are like decks we can create based off of this PDF? What are like workshops that we can create based off of this PDF? What are like potential like train the trainer models or like discussion guides that we can also like create? So like, don't be afraid to create like supplementary materials like after you create like the main thing.
The last thing I'll quickly add, and then Inji, I want to hear your thoughts too, is just like thinking about like the community too, like just like prioritizing dissemination, right? So making sure like we had like these long lists of people that we were going to send this guide to, so we made sure that people actually saw it. So I was just going to say that. But
cool. Yeah, and just some final thoughts. I think yeah, people discuss the two key elements. You know, on the one hand, it's engagement, but equally it's ensuring that whatever format it is, it's actually accessible for the audience. And so this speaks to, you know, the guide itself can look different. It can even be in a video format. It can be, you know, as simple as I've seen quite effective action guides even on Instagram when people are clicking through, you know, action 1, action 2, action 3, and those get really good engagement because they really meet the needs of the audience that they're trying to address. And so that speaks to the point about having supplementary materials in mind about when you're disseminating your guide in whatever shape or form that looks like. But equally, in terms of accessibility, it's making really sure that it meets the needs of your target audience. And so, you know, I mentioned videos can work for some people, and again, you know, some people are audio, you know, learners, and so that can be a really useful way of reaching them. But on the other hand, most parts of the world, in fact, don't have, you know, reliable access to internet that's sufficient to download or have access to stream these kind of lengthy videos. And so you know, in some contexts it's actually a lot easier just to download something and have it as a physical kind of copy on your hard drive. So it really depends on your audience. I'd really encourage you to think really in depth about what will be the most easy and accessible way for your audience to be able to have access to your content and to be able to disseminate it further within their community as well.
What a wonderful question to wrap up on. I want to thank all of our panelists for your time and your perspectives. Please, we will share all of these links that are referenced in this chat into the Slack channel as well. So please, please, please join the community in Slack and continue the conversation. Our speakers and panelists will be there to answer more questions. Again, thank you so much to everyone for this conversation, and hopefully we'll see you at another Cat Salon next year.